Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your co-hosts, Eugene Perrier, here alongside my intrepid co-host, as always, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back alongside you.
It's wonderful to be back alongside you, Eugene.
Excellent. Well, it's great to be back, of course, with all of you who are regular viewers and anyone who's new. Welcome. Great to have you back with us as well. As always, here on the Freedom Side, we've got a great show going all around the world, talking about a number of different things, from Ukraine 2 years on to the ongoing plight of Mumia Abu-Jamal, a political prisoner in the United States, some of the aftermath and significance of what took place with Aaron Bushnell's protest in front of the Israeli embassy, an update on Sudan, discussion about a new novel coming out of the Palestinian struggle, and, of course, the ongoing state of things as it concerns Palestine and the ongoing genocide. So we got a lot for you, as we always do here. So definitely, let people know however you want to let them know that we are live and we are moving forward, so that whoever is following you can follow us. Also, you're here, you're watching on YouTube. So while you're here, if you have not yet done so, this would be a great time to hit the subscribe button so that you're subscribed to all the content we have coming here from Breakthrough News, like, for instance, Dispatches with Rania Khalek, and hit the bell so that you get alerts about the things you subscribe to, so you don't have to go searching for them. So it's very easy for you to access all of the fantastic content we have here on BT. Rania, anything else you would like our viewers to know?
Yes, Eugene, there's a few things I'd like our viewers to know. First and foremost, you can help support all of our work here at Breakthrough News by becoming a member by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news, where you can access exclusive content as well as very cool merchandise, including this mug that I apologize for the lipstick stain, but I'm actually using it for real. Breakthrough News on one side, BT's logo on the other. Fantastic merch like this is available if you become a member of Breakthrough News by going again to patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can help support independent media at a very crucial time in history when we need independent media more than ever. And also, please make sure to like the show if you're watching on YouTube right now. It helps boost us in the algorithm. And what is it I usually say, Eugene? I'm sorry, Matt. Do you have it?
I've forgotten, actually. I don't know. What is it you usually say, Rania? Jesus.
I'll never stop loving that. Smash that like button, you guys. And yeah, but do smash that like button, seriously, because it does boost us in the algorithm. We're working against an algorithm that, promotes and forces down your throat outlets like CNN. So the more people who like the show, the more people's feeds it gets promoted into. So like us, subscribe, make sure you follow us on all social media platforms at BT Newsroom. Take it away, Eugene.
No, well, thank you, Rania. I appreciate that. Very comprehensive. Definitely happy to have everyone's support. And of course, to all our existing patrons, big shout out to you for everything you have been able to do to help us keep moving forward. So to get right into our show here today, we want to start with the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is one of the more well-known political prisoners here in the United States, whose case continues to be ongoing. The struggle for his freedom continues to be ongoing. And of course, the attempts of the state to make his life as miserable as possible certainly continues on a day-to-day basis. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Noel Hanrahan, who's the founder and director of Prison Radio, where you can hear Mumia Abu-Jamal's commentaries. Noel, thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. And before we delve into some of what's happening with Mumia right now, for those who maybe are less familiar of his case and how he ended up being trapped in prison for a number of decades, could you just give maybe a capsule view of who is Mumia Abu-Jamal and why has the U.S. government put him in prison for so many years?
Mumia Abu-Jamal is a brilliant journalist who practiced his trade in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the early 80s and 1970s. He was a trained broadcast journalist producing for NPR, Mutual Black Network, WHYY, and others. And he was targeted because he refused to not ask the difficult questions. He was He is very talented. So when he was arrested for the murder of a Philadelphia police officer, he was railroaded. It was an unfair trial. And I think the police knew who they had. They had a very articulate, dynamic African-American journalist who was holding the powerful accountable through his work. That's who Mumia Abu-Jamal is. Since he was arrested in 1981, he has continued to practice his journalism. He's written 13 books. The most recent was a trilogy called Murder Incorporated, Empire, Genocide, and Manifest Destiny, which is a real send-up of the United States imperialist agenda throughout history from its inception. So it was an amazing 3-volume series. He's now working on his PhD, studying Fanon, but he continues to practice as a journalist from inside. So he's been in for 41 years. And it's been my pleasure to work with him for many of those years. I began by pulling his first book out of prison, Live from Death Row, in 1994, and by placing his commentaries on National Public Radio. One of the marks of how good a journalist you are is by how the powerful target you. And Live from Death Row was targeted by none other than Bob Dole, who got up on the Senate floor and threatened NPR's funding for daring to air Mumia Abu-Jamal's broadcasts. At that point, he would have aired on 790 states in the U.S., Hungary, South Africa, and Canada. And every single person on NPR's All Things Considered was a bestseller in the New York Times. So they were threatened by his mere voice. Even from inside prison, they were threatened by what that could do if it were to make it outside.
In prison, over 42 years now. It's a very long time. He's been quite active inside, still doing journalism, and as a result has faced over these several decades behind bars, not only just being a political prisoner, but facing quite a bit of persecution. Can you talk about what he's had to endure throughout those several decades behind bars?
We exist in a place where they torture the people inside. And the people who have long sentences, or the people who are politically imprisoned, or people who are targeted by the state, often have much more difficult times. Mumia, for instance, for the first 8 years he was in, was denied visits and phone calls. And he wouldn't cut his hair. He had dreads. And so they punished him for that. After families protested, he was able to start getting visits and phone calls and do more writing. But he spent 8 years believing that he would be immediately released. He thought that was such a travesty. He had a judge, Albert Sabo, who said in the first week of the trial to a court reporter, "I'm going to help him fry the N-word." That's the kind of trial he had. And so he believed. I met him in year 11, and he believed he was getting out any day. It over the years became more clear that the state, once they have you, they're going to try and keep you. So he has faced serious issues. As we've been more able to get his word out, the Pennsylvania State House passed a law called the Silencing Act, threatening to take away any violent, quote unquote, violent criminals' pencils, paper, and phone calls. And that Silencing Act, we had to go to court for, get a preliminary injunction, and we had to beat it. But it was a political tool, a tactic to try and take away people's ability to do work. I took a camera crew in to see Mumia 5 times, and then they prevented camera crews from going in to see prisoners. Now, they will have camera crews go in to do TED Talks, and they'll have them do taking care of puppies or something. But they cannot censor based on what people say. And so I think people should advocate for getting cameras in again. But he has faced a lot of repression. He was in a solitary confinement cell for 29 years. He had 7 books that he was allowed to keep in his cell at any one time. He was often very far from his family. Solitary confinement in 11 by 7 cell with 18 inches from the cell to the bar, and confined all the time over weekends. That was extreme. So he has faced a lot of extreme conditions. And also, his health, because he's getting older, has deteriorated. So he's had significant health issues. 2017, he had hepatitis C, and they were denying him the cure. There was a cure, and they were denying it to him. So we had to go to court, get a preliminary injunction, and we won that, and we won it for many other prisoners around the country. He had double bypass surgery, heart condition, in 2021, and the prison now is denying him cardiac rehabilitation care. And that means he's not getting the right diet and he doesn't get enough exercise. So he's got an extreme skin condition, eczema, that is raging, and it's very difficult for him to get treatment for. So he's, at this current time, right now, he's very weak. And we need to have all our bright, white, hot spotlight on both his criminal case, because he's very likely innocent and deserves a new trial and deserves immediate freedom, and because of his medical issues are so severe that he absolutely needs medical care that he likely can only receive on the outside.
And, what is the status of where his criminal case is now? I mean, for those who follow this case, it's like, the avalanche of evidence that has come, not even just from the original trial, but it seems like, just year after year after year that I almost sometimes feel like I'm going crazy. Like, how are they not letting this man out of prison? There's so much information, but I know they keep finding ways to, deny it, push it off, do different things like that so that he doesn't have the opportunity to put most of this before a court in a real way. So where does that stand now?
We live in America, and in America, they have constructed the appeals process in the judiciary to preserve what they have done. So they have 30 years of incarcerating our mothers, fathers, cousins, our people, and they do not want to admit that mass incarceration, that over-incarceration targeted people of color and poor people. And so because of that, they are seeking to preserve the finality of all those convictions. So even if people are released based on police and prosecutorial misconduct, it's one at a time. It's not recognizing that they targeted everyone based on their race and class. And now they're trying to release them with that you need to prove things that are impossible to prove. But Mumia, in this case, and in some cases, he has direct evidence that they suppressed information and did not give it to his defense team. He has key evidence that they took blacks off the jury. So what they're doing is they're using these laws in Pennsylvania, the Post-Conviction Relief Act, to eliminate the ability of anyone, a judge, to examine the facts, the merits. So this last case he had in PCRA court, he had a document from a witness that said, "Where's my money?" right after the trial. So the witness, Robert Chobert, sent the DA a note saying, "Where's my money? I want to get paid for his testimony." Presumably it wasn't lunch money, it wasn't bus money, it wasn't, so, but they refused to even consider that evidence. And they just found it, they just released it. It's been buried for 40 years. They refused to consider it because they said that it wouldn't have overturned the conviction, which is impossible, frankly, because he was one of the only eyewitnesses. And he was likely paid. Robert Chobert, said his car was parked behind the officer's car. And the first photos from the Philadelphia Bulletin, which were also suppressed and not considered, show his cab wasn't there. Now, Robert Chobert, when he testified, they suppressed his parole, like he was on parole. And why they suppressed it is because they said it wasn't a crime of falsehood. He was convicted of throwing a Molotov cocktail into a school for pay. And he was driving an unlicensed cab. And he had asked the DA for help getting his license back. That's the kind of guy we're talking about. So, the fact that they've suppressed all this, every few years, some amazing evidence is found, and they find a way to argue that it should not be heard. And they don't argue it cumulatively either. So Pamela Demby, a judge, said that if Albert Sabo said, even if it were true, "I'm going to help him fry the N-word" in the first week of the trial, that it wouldn't have affected his rulings and it wouldn't have affected the outcome of the jury's verdict. So that is the way in which this class of people who are judges and former prosecutors. I would say Prysner is slightly better, our new prosecutor is slightly better. But the whole system wants to preserve what it did. Now the 45,000 people who are in prison, the 1,500 juvenile lifers, the 5,000 people with life sentences. And we have a vast array of corruption from the police department. These are Frank Rizzo's descendants. These are the sons of Rizzo. This is a majority white police force, 6,500 majority white police force who are banking on overtime from arresting poor people to pay their Jersey mortgages, to get the pay bump when they retire. So they are all about commodifying people, taking their votes. Like if a felon gets arrested and they get sent to prison upstate in the rural areas, they keep their representation. They actually get more Congress people because they have prisoners there. And when they come home, they don't get it back. They keep it. They are stripping people of money. They've taken a huge number of people out of our community. And it's it's a capitalist agenda. It's a plan. It's like, if you can't provide work and food for everyone, you need to be able to control the workforce and the labor pool. And if you want to privilege the white lower middle class by giving them these jobs, as police officers, that's a way of, running the system in a way that it separates people and stigmatizes certain people. And Mumia is a man. He's one man. He's caught up in this agenda, and he was willing to expose it. He still is.
I think it's all really important to reflect on that, especially as we talk about Julian Assange and the persecution going on in that case. I mean, there are so many political prisoners, not just the ones they're trying to extradite to the U.S., but already in the U.S. And so my question for you becomes, what are the options now? I mean, I guess legally speaking, right? Like, are there options to try to get him released given the situation with his health?
I think that Kevin Rashid Johnson, who's also a political prisoner in the United States and a gifted writer and a gifted artist, said about Mumia, he's not free because we're not free. So the options are building our power. And it is happening in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. It is a moment where we are literally building power. So the Abolitionist Law Center, the Amistad Law Project, Human Rights Coalition, the families of people inside have built from the inside out. And they elected two members of the city council who are working families party members, stone cold abolitionists. They elected Prysner. They've been appointed. Salim Holbrook from the Abolitionist Law Center has been appointed to be the Josh Shapiro's transition team, our governor. They are crushing it, and it's happening right now. It's also happening at a time where the U.S. is expanding its imperial agendas and also crushing people at home. So it's not easy, but I have a feeling that the people, at least where I live in Pennsylvania, are on fire. And they're making us pay a price. I mean, they're destabilizing our communities, And so I think, yes, what are our options to build power? Our options are to build power. Mumia Abu-Jamal will be free when we have the power and when we confront power. They can turn the key. They always do. When they need to, when they decide it's in their best interest, they just turn the key. He should be freed. They will find a way to free Mumia when we have the power.
No, I think it's a very well taken point, and it's a good example when we look at, Northern Ireland, this Palestinian struggle, political prisoners being linked to the real struggle on the ground is what makes a difference. Well, as always, Noelle, we really appreciate you coming on and helping inform people about all of these different pieces. Hope everyone is checking out Prison Radio on a regular basis. But as always, Noelle Hanrahan, founder and director of Prison Radio, thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Oh,
welcome back, Rania.
Thank you. Welcome back to you. I didn't see you for a moment. It was quite scary. No, I mean, I think it's important that we keep raising this issue. It's easy to forget about people as they age, and it's easy to forget because it's never framed this way that we have political prisoners inside the U.S. The U.S. likes to go on and on about anybody held anywhere in any adversary country, but we have it right here. Well, here at home, as in like where you are, because I'm not there right now, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just insane to think about. Like, as she was speaking, I was thinking about, okay, almost or over 42 years behind bars. Like, that's older than the both of us. Like,
Yeah.
Mumia Abu-Jamal has been in prison longer than you and I have been alive. That's crazy.
It is. I mean, it really is crazy. And I mean, when you really look into it, I mean, it's amazing the amount of information. And I thought that, Noelle laid it out very clearly, the so-called eyewitness who wasn't there. There's so many different, things that have turned out to be lies from the point of view of the police. There's actually like ballistic physical evidence that shows that it essentially would be impossible for him to have shot this officer based on, the
Right.
level of the wounds that the officer received. I mean, people being paid off left and right, also, I mean, it really is like the class, like when you think about like a Law and Order show or something like that, like a classic episode about a cover-up or something from some like old cop in the 70s that they're now trying to right those. It's like that kind of almost like cartoonish Hollywood style narrative and how, how ridiculous this cover-up has been. So I encourage folks to keep checking out. And Prison Radio is great. Mumia does commentary. Other incarcerated individuals do commentary as well, reporting from the inside on their conditions and talking about the conditions in the world. So something that anyone, I think, will be very you'll gain a lot from it. I'll say that. Well, we want to switch gears here and turn our attention to excuse me, the ongoing conversation around Aaron Bushnell and the protest that he did in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. earlier this week in protest of the genocide in Gaza. And we are very, very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Mike Prysner, who's a veteran, the host of the Eyes Left podcast, and also a producer for the Empire Files. Mike, thank you so much for being with us.
Yo, happy to be here.
Last night, I know that you participated with some other veterans and others who I think were gathering there in, I believe, the Portland area, and took place in a protest that was, I think representing a lot of what took place. I know a number of you burned your uniforms, and I guess I just wanted to ask you to talk about, why it was important for you and others to be out there and to engage in this sort of commemoration, and how that speaks to the significance of what Aaron Bushnell did earlier this week.
Yeah, sure. Well, there was a candlelight vigil last night of, over 200 people about, and led by over a dozen veterans, mostly in Iraq and Afghanistan, many of whom spoke in support or in honor of Aaron Bushnell. But the event culminated in all of us, burning the last pieces of uniforms that we had left from our military service. I think in the first place, like most of us had only kept these pieces of the uniform to begin with because we had been wearing them at protests over the years against the Iraq war and against imperialism. But for many of us, it was like the last pieces that we had. One of the veterans like threw all his medals in with it as well. And, I think we did that first and foremost to find some way to pay a deep tribute to Aaron Bushnell and his sacrifice. Because, and the same goes for like why it was an action led by veterans, of course, Bushnell being an active duty service member, is because all of us, really feel very deeply what Aaron Bushnell was going through and can relate to that kind of crisis of conscience of having joined something that you think is going to be something great and good and honorable and just, and coming to the realization, through our own experiences and through wearing that uniform, that we were actually a part of something quite the opposite. And, everyone has their own process of grappling with those realizations. And so, part of that action, of course, was to honor Aaron Bushnell, but also to send a message to other veterans and service members who are likely grappling with the same thing and who may have been moved by what Aaron Bushnell did, but feel very much alone in the military like Aaron Bushnell did. And so, we wanted to send a message that Aaron Bushnell was not alone and that others are not alone and that there's a place for you, and that place is in the struggle. I think the significance of what Aaron Bushnell did, of course, self-immolations against war are always significant events, but the fact that it was an active duty member of the military who did so in uniform and who made a very explicit connection to that, they did that for a very good, very serious reason. I think there's so much significance in that. I think in large part, it's just deepening the crisis for Washington. The U.S. government is really, in a state of chaos externally and internally over the just unabashed support for the Israeli genocide on Gaza, and to have one of their own service members in uniform, who by all accounts was a normal and genuine person. I mean, of course, I think the worst they've been able to do to try to characterize Aaron Bushnell as a crazy person is to say that he was an anarchist, as if that's some insane thing. And if that's all they've been able to come up with, and everyone who's known him, even people who went to basic training with him, have a very different story. And I think that's obvious to so many people. And I think you can see the nervousness among the Pentagon and the White House over the significance of this action, because they've been asked about it twice. The White House press secretary was asked about it, and the Pentagon spokesperson was asked about it in press conferences. And both of them, and in particular, the Pentagon spokesperson, I think it was even more disgusting because, this is someone in the Aaron Bushnell's chain of command, someone who's supposed to care about them and worry about them. Their responses when asked about the action of Aaron Bushnell, and the Pentagon spokesperson specifically was asked, do you think this is indicative of a larger trend in the military, of members of the military being concerned or upset about the use of U.S. supplied weapons on Gaza civilians? And the response was essentially, Israel has the right to defend itself. And so not denying the criticisms that Aaron Bushnell was raising, or the things that Aaron Bushnell was horrified by, not denying those things, but to say, if you're mad about those things like Aaron Bushnell was, if you're mad about these images and videos of children being mangled, or now children starving to death, or 100 people being massacred as they try to get food, if you're mad about that, you shouldn't be, because this is Israel's legitimate right to self-defense. And so that's that response there tells you, I think, maybe internally the kind of crisis that they're in, and how Aaron Bushnell has helped deepen the commitment of people to the struggle for Palestine, but also deepen the crisis for Washington.
Yeah. And, I think I saw there was something going around from Israelis trying to say, oh, people hate us so much, they're killing themselves because they hate us. And I'm just like, that's really what you're taking away from this? Wow. But, one thing that also seems, Mike, to be getting lost in all of this is that it wasn't just an act of protest against Israeli actions, but also the U.S. complicity in them. Could you talk a bit more about the actual complicity of the U.S. in facilitating the genocide in Gaza?
Sure. Well, I think all Americans, one of the reasons that so many are moved to go into the streets is because there is a very clear recognition that, who is providing the political cover for Israel, who is vetoing the ceasefire resolutions, who is doing all of the propaganda at the White House press conferences, whose media outlets are putting out all of the bogus stories that try to cover up all the Israeli war crimes, who is approving the budgets through Congress and through executive action outside of Congress to make sure that more and more weapons are rushed to Israel. It's the United States that is enabling it at every single turn. But for Aaron Bushnell specifically, to know that, like so many other Americans are dealing with, knowing that their tax dollars, it's tax day is almost coming up. Everyone's got to be paying their taxes. To know that like a big chunk of that, in fact, like the majority chunk of that, is going to buy those weapons that will be being sent to Israel. But to know, if someone like Aaron Bushnell, who not only had to grapple with that all Americans are dealing with, but to actually have to put on the uniform every day of the U.S. Air Force, the institution that is flying those weapons from the United States to Israel, that's providing logistical support. The Pentagon is open about providing assistance to Israel, not just in the transport of weapons, but in, strategy and how they're going to rescue hostages and all of these phrases that we know very much means much more than just trying to rescue hostages. It means military guidance and logistical support. So for Aaron Bushnell, dealing with what so many Americans are dealing with, but also having to wear the uniform of the same people that are providing those weapons. And then even though it's not really apparent that Aaron Bushnell had any direct role in any of this, knowing that you are part of facilitating this institution of mass killing, it must have been a very difficult thing for him to put on that uniform every day, to look at himself in the mirror, to go to work with colleagues who may have been on a completely different page with him in terms of their view of the Gaza genocide. And so, I think that's, of course, why he wore that uniform in the statement to say that the U.S. military itself is a part of this genocide, and that he wanted to take a bold stand against it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you alluded to this somewhat even in the opening in the context of the vigil that took place last night, Mike. But I mean, I think since the Spanish-American War on, active duty service members and veterans have often protested and raised their voice against, these wars and occupations. And I think that's a history that also has not really been brought out in the stories about Aaron Bushnell, but I think that should be. And so I was hoping you could at least talk a little bit, obviously it's a big topic, about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think throughout U.S. history, you have service members who protest against war, but you also have service members that take very bold actions that put their lives on the line to protest war. You can go back 1899, U.S. occupation of the Philippines. You had, of course, a folk hero named David Fagan, a black soldier who deployed to the Philippines, who abandoned his own lines, went to the Philippine resistance fighters, and joined the guerrilla struggle against the people that he was fighting alongside just a couple days prior, and became actually a commander in the Philippine resistance forces. But it wasn't just David Fagan, the one who's most remembered, even though that's a buried history on its own, but many other black soldiers either fled to join the Philippine resistance, fled their own lines, or attempted to flee and were hanged for it. And so this is, I think, has a lot of parallels to what Aaron Bushnell did, because you have soldiers who were able to see in other people who were lived on the other side of the world and spoke a different language and had a different religion. They could see themselves in the others, and they could identify with the people that they were supposed to be fighting or sent to fight more so than they identified with their own commanders, and were willing to not just remove themselves from it by just like disappearing or going to try to live a life by themselves on the Philippine countryside, but to actually put their lives on the line to try to stop that injustice from happening, which is what so many did. And every single war in American history, you see manifestations of this, both in the mass sense of large numbers of soldiers that rebel in some form or another, whether that's going AWOL or resisting within the ranks or joining the protest movements. But then you have people, giants of that history, like Aaron Bushnell, who take extremely bold action that puts them either in prison or puts their life on the line to do that kind of thing. I mean, and even in recent wars, I mean, this isn't just a manifestation of the draft, but, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, you have a real vibrant history of rebellion. And even though that history isn't very well known, it's something that has very much happened. Some of the people get noticed and seen because they are in the media, or they do bold things. But in large part, 99% of the people that engage in some form of rebellion from the active duty ranks, you never hear their names and you never know of their actions, but they're happening. And, the one thing I'll close on with this is there's also a misconception about this, that active duty people rebel out of this kind of self-preservation, that, they sign up to try to get access to I'll get some free college and some job training. But when it really comes down to it, I'm willing to compromise my morals to get that stuff. But when it really comes down to it, I don't want to get my legs blown off, or I don't want to get killed. So that's when I'm going to draw the line and say, I'm going to get out of here. The GI Rights Hotline, which is an important resource for anyone who's in the military who wants to get out. I was just speaking on the Eyes Left podcast to their executive director, and she told me that probably the two biggest surges that she has ever seen in calls to the GI Rights Hotline. I mean, phone ringing off the hook of active duty people who are saying, I got to get out. How do I file to be a conscientious objector? One was, of course, the George Floyd uprising and the mass protest against racism in this country, people not wanting to wear the American flag on their shoulder anymore. But the other one, which I found fascinating, more people calling the GI Rights Hotline after this incident rather than, oh, you're getting deployment order, a bunch of people are going to deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan. It was after the news came out that the United States had bombed the Kunduz Doctors Without Borders hospital in Afghanistan. And just the association with that war crime, knowing that the uniform that they were wearing was part of an institution that would kill doctors in a hospital, and no longer wanting to be associated with it, even though their lives were not at risk at all, and they weren't part of the units that actually carried out the act, that the recognition that the institution they thought they joined was something very, very different, motivated them to throw their careers away and take that radical act of turning in paperwork to say, I'm not going to be a part of this anymore. You can't deploy me, you can't give me a weapon, and you got to give me a discharge. I think that's something that many people may not realize. And I think people who are organizers and in the movement, it's important for them to understand, the triggers and the mindset of people who are in the military today. And of course, Aaron Bushnell must just be the tip of the iceberg for people in the active duty ranks right now.
Fascinating context.
Well, yeah. I mean, with all that in mind, I'm just curious, how have anti-war veterans and service members been responding in the wake of Aaron Bushnell's actions?
Well, I think, in the many that I'm in touch with, it was it hit really hard as and it was just a very heavy incident. And I think that so many of us could see ourselves in Aaron Bushnell and, know how close many of us were and not to doing something like that, but into feeling that level of despair and helplessness in this awakening that we had of political consciousness. And so, it's been a kind of, I think, dark time for a lot of vets, but I think I think overall what we're seeing is that the impact it's having is that vets and active duty people are actually in the struggle and they're in the streets for Palestine. And while Aaron Bushnell's action was a personal, solitary action that they took, countless people in the reserves and the National Guard, in the active duty. I know many who traveled to the last national demonstration in Washington, D.C. And of course, many veterans are actually in the streets. And this is where they've been historically. But I think already since the genocide has been happening, there's been this huge influx of active duty and reserve and guard service members who are joining the protests. But I think that is going to be amplified by the sacrifice of Aaron Bushnell.
Well, Mike, as always, really appreciate you being willing to give us some of your time. Mike Prysner, war veteran, host of the Eyes Left podcast, and a producer for the Empire Files. Thank you so much, as always, for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Very glad to be able to provide a bit of a corrective there for what the rest of the media seems to think needs more investigation. We're not sure why he did what he did.
Yeah.
We're just going to ignore everything he said while he did it, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, no, it's
freaking insane.
It's amazing. Kay Pritzker here, Breakthrough News, did a video about that where he has some of the clips from some of these media people trying to, dissemble and say it's about something that it's not about. It's really, honestly, shocking. So I hope people also have the opportunity to check that out. And Mike was on for a longer conversation last night with Brian Becker on the Socialist program here on Breakthrough News. You can also find on our YouTube page where you are right now. So don't go right now, but definitely go later, longer, deeper, and I think very important discussion of all these issues, in both those different spaces. So thanks to Mike and to Kay and to the Socials program. Well, we are going to move our agenda forward here and move to the country of Sudan, where there, of course, is a major ongoing crisis. I think 25 million people facing acute hunger, serious humanitarian crisis, ongoing civil war. And we are very happy to be joined here on the show once again by Mossab Baba, who is a researcher on Sudan. Mossab, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Rania, Eugene. Nice to be on here again.
Great to have you here. On the U.S. side of things, the United States just recently appointed a new special envoy to Sudan. And, of course, that is being talked a lot about. And they're saying they want to play a role in, bringing peace and ending the conflict and so on and so forth. But I guess my first question for you in some ways, Mossab, is can we actually expect the United States to be sort of an honest broker in this conflict, which is sort of the way they're kind of presenting themselves, the person coming from outside, who every side can sort of trust and work with?
It's a bit complicated with the U.S. relationship with Sudan, and it goes back to the 70s and the 80s, kind of having a closer relationship. But what's been happening in the past, maybe I'd say 10 years or so, the U.S. has kind of handed off the policy on Sudan to the kind of, quote unquote, the normalization countries, UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and stuff. So increasingly, they've been having less and less, leverage and influence, especially when it comes to the military and the militia, the paramilitary RSF forces. The kind of main problem, and I think when it came to this new envoy, was people were expecting him to report directly to Biden to kind of show the seriousness of this and show like some kind of commitment. But unfortunately, he's reporting to the same State Department people who've been running the show for the past few years. So we still don't know like how they're going to start working with Sudan. Like, are they going to pressure the UAE? Are they going to pressure, Egypt and stuff like that, or is it just going to be the regular stuff? Letting these countries kind of maintain their influence over the military and the RSF, and just kind of do some more fluff kind of diplomacy. Yes, we want a democratic transition and civilian government, and supporting some of the politicians, and not actually going to the root of the problem, which is the issue of the militarization, like of the entire government, of entire societies, of entire tribes. I mean, there's been a lot of atrocities. I mean, there's recent reports about like actual slavery happening in Darfur as a result of the RSF militia kind of just going wild without any checks. So people are still going to look at kind of what this new envoy would bring to the table, but again, like nobody's kind of holding their breath for the U.S. to come and exert the kind of pressure that's needed. I mean, because the pressure points where it's needed is entangled with other issues of Gaza and all this stuff. So it's for U.S. policy, it's like there's always that element of trying to keep the status quo, but kind of changing the wrapping every time. How about this wrapping? Do you like this? And it's not. I don't see it kind of going anywhere. There is a lot of pressure on U.S. policies in the region, whether it's Gaza and by extension, the Houthis. And they're also afraid because Iran's been, supporting the military, especially recently. And like, the old school kind of Islamists, connecting back again with the kind of model that they were actually seeking, which is the Iranian model. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and it's a little bit difficult to get like a solid reading of where U.S. or Western policy in general is going to go. But in general, because the main problem, and I think why it prompted them to have an envoy, is because of the recent escalation. Within the past month, you've had increasing battles. You have a complete internet shutdown from the entire country that crippled like localized humanitarian aid. It's crippling monetary transfers. It's crippling all this stuff. And in addition to that, like the RSF militia took advantage of the internet blackout, and they're like ravaging entire states right now. Like Jazeera State is directly south of Khartoum, and RSF has been going wild over there, raiding one village after another. And it's like we don't hear it until somebody gets out of those areas into a place where there's, somebody has a Starlink or something and is able to communicate what exactly is happening in those areas. So yeah, the people are following kind of the appointments and stuff like that, but like the reality on the ground just makes it a little bit difficult to kind of get a solid reading for what like a new U.S. envoy would mean.
And then there's an interesting dynamic that came to be a few weeks ago, or came to be known a few weeks ago, and that's the role of Ukrainian special forces being active in Sudan. The U.S., or not U.S., I should say, the international corporate mainstream media was portraying this as something almost like positive, and that the Ukrainian special forces were there to fight the Russian mercenaries from the Wagner group. That's how it was being portrayed. And I'm just curious if you can give us an understanding of how this other war has now somehow inserted itself into the war in Sudan.
Oh, that's been one of the most puzzling things. There's been a lot of talk about Ukrainian forces coming and supporting the army and pushing back the RSF. because the RSF had a relationship with the Wagner group, and had some relations, on and off with Moscow. But it's kind of urban legends slash ghost stories. Like, we keep hearing about it, but never anywhere on the ground where that's actually transpiring. It's pretty odd, but I think because I think Russian policy has kind of changed after the war, and that's why it's so weird. Like, taking out the head of Wagner and kind of pushing back a little bit on, like, the Russians have been, backtracking a little bit on supporting militias in the region and stuff like that. And it seems like they're switching more towards supporting the military. So for the Ukrainians to come and jump in at a time like this, it's, I think it's more of a PR thing because of, like, the dwindling support for the Ukrainian war in the first place. You know what I mean? Like, supporting Ukraine has become, like, really, like, what are you actually going to achieve? So it seems like it's more kind of a PR stunt. Maybe they've provided some kind of technical support to SAF, or there's a long history of that. But I honestly haven't seen, like, any credible reports and any credible information that of Ukrainians actually being on the ground and fighting alongside SAF. I mean, because the first question that comes to mind, like, you have a whole war going on in Ukraine. You really have the time to actually come out to Sudan and help us. So it's a little bit, it's more of a PR stunt. It seems like it, rather than being like an actual conflict dynamic.
One of the other things I was hoping you could talk about, Mossab, I mean, obviously, the humanitarian crisis is terrible, but it does seem that there is a lot of sort of grassroots resiliency in the sense that people are really trying to organize to help themselves and help their neighbors, however they can, as much as they can. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, because I feel like we hear the bad things, but we don't see how the people are really trying to organize themselves to grapple with them either.
Yeah, that's kind of a reflection of, the movement in Sudan since 2018 has been something that's been rarely analyzed and reported on adequately. It's also this thing of, people are very adamant about, color revolutions and the West coming in and trying to destabilize and everything, but they're not used to it. It was like the other way around, the US trying to keep, the status quo with the existing military government, but the people kind of uprising because the level of how widespread the movement is mind-boggling. Like, nothing like it has happened in Sudan before. So of course, even with the war, that doesn't just evaporate overnight. It's actually, it's seeped in to become like kind of the youth culture of communal volunteering, of protecting the neighborhood, because this was times when, Burhan's government as well as the RSF were like cracking down on neighborhoods and raiding neighborhoods, looking for protesters, killing protesters, all of this stuff. So it's almost like there's become a culture of very grassroots, each one teach one, each one protect one kind of mode of operation. And after the war, we started seeing that, where you have things like emergency rooms, you have things like shelters, you have all these things run by volunteers. But also in other places, like in Darfur, for example, you have IDP camps where there's millions of IDPs, and they've always been used to self-organizing. Political parties and like armed movements and, the RSF, and everybody would try to kind of get them on their side, but their thing is very clear. Like, we have a community over here that's deprived of the basic rights and basic services, and we need you to bring that. Don't worry, don't try to come at us with any kind of political agenda or anything. Self-organized, horizontal structures, everything that you would like to see from a grassroots movement has kind of been, there is the element of from region to region, it takes on different forms. But in general, the idea of kind of grassroots solidarity, horizontal solidarity, has been a huge theme in Sudan since 2018. Because there's a legacy of that before then. There's been since 1964, 1985, there's been these grassroots uprisings that have removed dictators. So this is kind of a continuation of that. But the problem is right now with this internet shutdown, these are young people in their neighborhoods, diaspora sending them money so that they can set up soup kitchens and stuff like that. But now with this internet blackout, they're really raising the red flag, like this is a humanitarian crisis, and they're not able to actually do this, community level service and volunteering and stuff. So there is a huge legacy of that, and I think one day it will be written and that story will be told, adequately. But right now, with the war and the humanitarian disaster that's happening, people's attention is kind of a little bit elsewhere rather than focusing on that. But there is, even when it comes to, ceasefires, the first ceasefires from the war were community efforts, youth, volunteers, along with the community elders, along with the tribal leaders and religious leaders, going to both sides, going to SAF and to RSF, and telling them that, hey, if this is a power struggle, go and fight in Khartoum and go to fight military to military. Please don't bring this into our neighborhoods and into our towns and into our villages. So there's a lot of that, you're right, that isn't really highlighted as much. We try as much as possible to do that coverage with a lot of the journalists and the filmmakers and stuff that we work with. But it's just the sound of guns and airplanes and, artillery and stuff. It usually drowns out the sound of these grassroots actors.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, we really appreciate you being willing to join us and help us keep eyes on Sudan. Mossab Baba, researcher, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you, Eugene. Appreciate it.
Rania?
Yeah, it's like the war that won't end. Is this war in Sudan? It just keeps chugging along and taking more lives and causing more famine. I mean, and the numbers are just staggering. And the lack of attention is also staggering. So I'm glad that
25 million people, I think, suffering from
cover
hunger.
it. Would you say? You said how many people? 25 million.
About 25 million. Yeah.
That's such a wild. I mean, 25
about 40%
million
of the population.
People. It's wild.
Yeah.
And it gets no attention, and also when it does get attention, it's just described as this very complicated, nobody understands sort of issue. So I'm glad that we can know, because I think we've been able to provide coverage for it several times over the last, since the war started, we've given it a lot of attention. I'm happy we've been able to, and from the perspective of people who actually understand what's going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even, during the big protest movement, we were able to have the resistance committees, the Sudanese Communist Party. So not to say that to pat ourselves on the back, but just, a reminder for people who do want to dive deeper. We got a lot of content stretching back to even before the conflict started to help you understand it. Because, I think it's like everything, it's like if you know nothing about it, of course it's complicated. But, once you know the facts on the ground, it's actually not that complex at all, and relatively easy for people to understand. And, huge amount of regional meddling, and this Palestine is very closely linked to that, but that's another topic for another time. But an important piece, and we really appreciate Mossab, and also a good friend of the show, Ahmed, who helped us get hooked up with Mossab. We want to turn our attention here now and move to the issue of Palestine, and we're giving this one another shot. A very important story about a very important new book coming directly from the Palestinian struggle. That is The Trinity of Fundamentals by Wissam Rafidi, which is a fantastic book. As I said a couple of weeks ago, it's really, I read it in 3 days. I really could not put this book down. Couldn't recommend it any higher, 1804books.com. But we want to get into all of that and more, the significance of the text and how it fits in with everything. We're very honored to be joined by Dalia Awad, who is a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
Well, oh, no, of course. It really is an honor to have you here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have the book. I left my copy. I was going to hold it up. Maybe we have a graphic somewhere. But, It's such an important and a powerful novel, but I think in this context with, the genocide we're seeing and all these different pieces, I think a question a lot of people are asking for themselves, is it overly indulgent maybe to make time to read a novel and all these different pieces? So, why is this novel important in this moment?
Yeah, and I think that's a very fair question to be asking. I would start by saying that this goes beyond being just a novel. This is a political text that takes us through the history of Palestine, during the 80s and the early 90s, and it follows a revolutionary who goes into clandestine living while hiding from the Zionist occupation, while continuing to contribute to the party and to be an active agent in the struggle for liberation. And really, it does provide a lot of historical context and analysis, but what's more is that we follow our protagonist Kanaan in his process of building up his mental fortitude to be able to remain steadfast for the struggle of liberation, which is no easy feat, and I think something that all of us can learn from. But also, I would add that there's an added layer to this that has to do with the Zionist project's continued attempt to sever ties for Palestinians, and that has to do with severing, for starters, our accumulated knowledge as it relates to what we know about previous revolutionaries and the practices that they've held and what that's looked like. This novel itself was written in Zionist prisons and was then liberated from those prisons. And there's again an attempt to sever our connection from the revolutionaries and political leaders that end up in Zionist prisons. And lastly, Palestinians who live in the far diaspora are severed in a different way as a result of language. And so the process of translating this novel was important to maintain those connections and to kind of begin to build that, fill in that gap, as again, like the Zionist project has attempted to sever those connections in a lot of different ways since its inception. And so this is, for us, a really important project because it's making sure that that political knowledge that that has been liberated from Zionist prisons is available for ourselves, but also folks we're in joint struggle with, because it's not just something that Palestinians can learn from. It's all folks who are fighting against imperialism can learn from, Kanaan and what he experienced and kind of the internal struggles that we each face and contradictions that we come up against. I think those are pieces that are true across movements.
Sorry, I had to cough for a moment. I think it's really wonderful that this novel exists. And I'm just curious if, since we're on the subject of a novel about the Palestinian political prisoners, and that's a very important issue that is currently a problem today. It's one of the biggest demands of the Palestinian resistance in Gaza for a ceasefire, is that we will release your prisoners when you will release ours. So I want you to elaborate a bit on the connection to today. When we talk about political prisoners and the importance of political prisoners, what's the situation for political prisoners today? Because I think that's what makes this book not only relevant because of the past, but also because of the present context.
Yeah. So currently there are more than 10,000 political prisoners being held in Zionist prisons. They are being prevented from receiving healthcare, basic rights, and really experiencing a lot of different human rights violations, for lack of a better term. But the Palestinian political prisoners have always been the compass that guide the Palestinian struggle. So they have been very much the political leaders, thinkers, writers, and it's an approach that the Zionist entity has, which is to take key Palestinian figures like Ahmed Saadat, Marwan Barghouti, and put them in prison and kind of throw away the key. There's, widespread use of administrative detention, which is imprisonment without trial or cause or anything like that. And at this point in time, too, I would also say, like, the use of political prisoners is a way to fragment Palestinian society, but also fragment Palestinian liberation when you're taking away key actors. And it's a process to make sure that you're removing people so they don't accumulate knowledge and so they don't build up cadres. And this is kind of the novel that follows somebody who was 22. The Zionists are wanting to imprison him. And then the party tells him, no, we want you to go into clandestine living, because this is a point in time where Palestinian factions are moving back to organizing in historic Palestine, and they want to accumulate knowledge and build out cadres. And so he goes into hiding for 9 years, which is no small feat. to do in Ramallah and the West Bank. And I think also to say, like, even today, the process of Palestinians in the West Bank's ability to hide or evade arrest from the Zionist entity is very difficult. So the fact that Wissam Rafidi was able to do that for 9 years is truly a significant feat. But also, the process of writing the novel itself was really a collective process. He needed to rely on his comrades in prison, so he would be able to write it, at night, so the prison guards wouldn't be able to see the novel itself. And then, whenever there were raids to different cells, there was a process of assembling a quote-unquote fax, which is taking the papers, wrapping them up in plastic and then in dough, and throwing them to another division or another part of the prison, so the guards wouldn't then confiscate the novel. And then at one point in time, and unfortunately, the person who was throwing the fax didn't throw it hard enough, or not exactly, missed, and it landed in the hands of the Zionist guard at the time, and they confiscated the novel. And Wissam thought the novel was lost forever. And the novel was so powerful that it was being used in the Prysner curriculum. And that's also something, the Prysner movement has fought extensively to get rights like education in Zionist prisons. And those curriculums are very political in nature. And so he thought the novel was lost until he was released and then rearrested under administrative detention. He found, a comrade was showing him the curriculum in a different prison, and he saw the name of his book on there, and he was surprised because he hadn't written a copy of the book. And what had happened was a comrade in Gaza had loved the book so much that he hand transcribed it, like comma for comma, full stop, like it was very detailed. And so then 4 comrades, I believe it was 54 capsules, which is the process of producing the paper of the novel, putting it into capsules, smuggled it out of that prison and brought it to Wissam. And then he himself smuggled it into another prison and then smuggled it out of the prison so it could be published, because he realized that this piece of revolutionary knowledge needed to be shared outside of the prison itself. And so just to say that the process too of the novel itself just speaks to the collective resistance in prisons of our prisoners. And so like the process of it being liberated from Zionist prisons and it being protected or preserved was in itself, speaks to the importance of also the knowledge that is in prisons that the Zionist entity is trying to hide or disappear or erase consistently. And I think, I don't know for myself, but I do have questions about what other pieces of literature have been confiscated and yet to be released.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I think we've been alluding to in the context of the whole book, and obviously one of the pieces, I mean, it feels like such, and I like the phrase you use, it's not just a novel, it's a political text. I mean, it also seems to speak to so many of the critical questions. I mean, there's so much in there about the political party and the role of parties and the role they play. It's not only socialism as an ideology, but the history of socialism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, all these different pieces that I think anyone who wants to change the world with now really has to grapple with. So even though it's about a time that was several decades ago, it just felt so timely in this moment in terms of like, what does it take to move the world in a better place? I don't know what the question is there, but just a reflection I had that maybe you have some thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I think there's a question for sure. This book was written 20 years ago. How relevant is it now? And how much does it still ring true for today? And I think a lot of the different pieces in terms of the internationalism, he's talking about local political events that are happening, but also regional ones and global ones. And a lot of the times drawing strength from folks from other struggles to maintain his rootedness and his commitment to the Palestinian struggle. I think too, it just is, it's a text that ultimately is also showing the revolutionary or the person engaging in the struggle for liberation as a full person, which I think is important for novels because sometimes we fall into a potential risk of over romanticizing who the revolutionaries are and who partakes in the struggles for liberation, when in reality, there are pieces that they're grappling with that all of us grapple with, whether that has to do with love or, things that have to do with really, like, he goes into details about the songs that he likes, the books, the novels that he's reading that are Soviet novels, or even he talks about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a lot of it, so he refers to he draws from a lot of different revolutionaries and socialists efforts to maintain his own rootedness in the Palestinian struggle. Just to say that, like, while there are specific pieces to the novel that are very culturally very rooted in the Palestinian experience, the other pieces go beyond that, and I think are ones that are about Palestine, but also about just it's a little bit timeless in the sense of whether it's now 20 years ago or now, or Palestine or elsewhere. So I think there's a little bit of that with the novel.
Story you told, I'm still kind of blown away, just the amount of dedication it takes to smuggle a book out of a prison. And I think it's worth just reiterating when we talk about political prisoners in Palestine, the conditions. What are the conditions that we're talking about here? Because it has to be pretty bad for people to have to smuggle pages of a text out in capsules.
Yeah, I mean, the conditions for Palestinian political prisoners are pretty atrocious, to put it nicely. Things that Palestinian political prisoners have had to fight for are, education, ability to have texts to read in prisons, visitation rights from their families. At a certain point in time, the Zionist entity intentionally moved the locations of prisons to be further away. So Palestinians attempting to visit their loved ones needed permits to do so. And so it would take longer to be able to visit people. It's really an attempt to isolate people and make them removed from the community, from Palestinian life as a whole. The question of who's able to visit Palestinian political prisoners is reserved for your immediate family only, which, if you are aware of like Palestinian and Arab culture, we don't just look at the nuclear family as being our family. It goes beyond that. So you're really making people's circles also a lot smaller. There's a process of having people under administrative detention. So this was something that the Zionists took from the British colonization, but it's the process of putting people in prison without charge or trial. And this can span, like with Wissam Rafidi, his second imprisonment was for 4 years under administrative detention. The longest Palestinian prisoner under administrative detention, I believe, went up into 25 years of imprisonment, if I'm not mistaken. And he had no sense of why, and there was no date for a trial or anything like that. There's also obviously quite a bit of torture that people are subjected to. And then there's different forms of torture, which are medical negligence. So you have Palestinian political prisoners who are ill and then intentionally prevented from seeking or getting any type of medical attention. And we've had martyrs as a result of that. Adnan Khadir was martyred, I believe it was not last year, but the year before, and he was on a hunger strike, and he was on administrative detention, and because they refused to break his administrative detention, he died as a result. And for Palestinian women who are in prisons, they don't have access to sanitary products. There have been cases of women who are like, if there are pregnant women in prisons, they're giving birth while all their limbs are chained. Like, it's very barbaric situations. I don't have to keep going into the details, but just to say that, like, this is also part of the Zionist project trying to make it so the bill that Palestinians have to pay for resistance is quite high, and so people turn their back on resistance. However, it hasn't been effective as a tool. Instead, they have just accumulated thousands and thousands of Palestinians in prisons. And it's important to note that Palestinians also in prisons really focus on political development and education and having sharp analysis, which is why they remain the compass for our struggle. They're unwavering in their commitment as to what it means to have a liberated Palestine and what that looks like and who our enemies are. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your question. I realize that was relatively long.
No, it does. It does.
Peace.
No, critically important, and I really appreciate it. And we really appreciate you joining us, Dalia Awad, a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement, who we are very grateful to for playing a role in helping to bring Trinity of Fundamentals out to our attention. 1804books.com. You can check it out. But Dalia, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much.
Great book. Couldn't recommend it any higher. I'm telling you.
You
so
should get it. If for the only reason to get it is the amount of work people went through to make it be a book.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a wild story. It deserves its own book.
Yeah,
Getting
no, it
that book
does. It
out of
does.
prison deserves a book and a movie in and of itself.
It definitely should
So,
be
yeah.
a movie. Anyone who reads it, you'll see that. And, you know, anyone who's like is like a real communist, there's some good Easter eggs in there for you about some of the books he was reading, some of the Soviet books and things like that, you know, only certain people are going to really know what it means, but it's fantastic when you see it. Nonetheless, check it out, 1804books.com. We want to keep the focus here on Palestine. We are going to move to our next guest, who is the first person who even told me the book Trinity of Fundamentals existed, but we're going to be talking to her about many things going on in terms of Palestine. Layan Sima Fuleihan, who's the education director at the People's Forum. Layan, as always, an honor to have you back with us.
It's great to be back with you.
Well, a lot of conversation, a lot of talk now over whether or not there will or will not be a ceasefire. I think a lot of people, you know, often get confused because there's you know, shuttle diplomacy and this proposal and that proposal. But of course, I think what a lot of people in the United States are thinking about is Biden's, you know, ice cream trip where he said there's going to be a ceasefire by Monday. So where does this stand? I mean, how realistic does it seem that could happen? And what are some of the proposals that are on the table?
Well, it's honestly a bit unclear because thanks to Biden and his unwillingness to provide any restraint on the Israelis and his unwillingness to actually engage in what would be real negotiations, an actual ceasefire isn't currently on the table. The latest draft of the proposal, I think actually it was talked about on the show a couple of weeks ago, end of January. There was this Paris paper that was presented to the Palestinian resistance that would outline a three-phased ceasefire that had different phases with different requirements that would need to be met. The latest draft that was delivered earlier this week actually has thrown out the idea of a permanent ceasefire. Right now, what's being debated is the conditions for a temporary truce. And Biden, the U.S. administration, for the first time used the word ceasefire in their proposal to the UN not so long ago. You can definitely tell that they're feeling the heat and that they would like us to think that they're working towards a ceasefire. But if you actually look at what they are pushing, they are asking for really, they're asking for the release of all the Israelis who are being held now by the resistance in Gaza, and giving very little back to the Palestinian people for what would be a temporary truce. And we know what happened last time there was a temporary truce. The killing didn't stop. The sniper attacks didn't stop. The bombardments didn't stop. This morning, the massacre that the world woke up to was absolutely horrific. So it's really difficult to understand this as negotiations. What it really feels more like is blackmail. Biden and Netanyahu are in their own different ways saying, if you don't agree to our terms, we will escalate the massacre. Biden, by saying that a ceasefire deal will be reached on Monday without any real proof, in a sense, really only puts pressure on the resistance, and is making promises that are really not confirmed to be achievable, and is raising people's hopes in a way that is very misleading. And so I think we have to be alert to the role the United States is actually playing in this process. And right now, concretely, what they're doing, despite the fact that they would like us to think that they are concerned for Palestinian civilian life, right now what they're doing is trying to force an Israeli victory on the Palestinian people by creating conditions that are absolutely untenable for sustaining life.
It's really shocking, Layan, just how far the U.S. is willing to support this barbarity. I mean, I'm sure you saw it was about a week ago that we saw this report by a group of UN experts talking about evidence that the Israelis are systematically sexually assaulting Palestinian women and girls. And the stories are horrific. And the U.S. spokespeople basically brushed it aside as, Israel will investigate it. This isn't a credible investigation. You also have the fact that today the Israelis fired at people and killed over 100 people, I believe, 100 Palestinians who were waiting for food aid, as they used starvation as a weapon, which they were clear about back in October when Yoav Gallant talked about essentially starving, quote unquote, human animals in Gaza of food and water. And here we are, where now in north of Gaza, you've got babies dying of malnutrition. It just feels so unbelievably depraved because it is. And then you have the self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell. I'm just curious if you can comment on the different aspects of that, because I think for a lot of people right now, especially those who have become active around this issue, it's a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. As almost 5 months into this genocide, there seems to be no end in sight. And our leadership in the US seems perfectly willing to continue to arm the Israelis as they impose a siege of like mass starvation.
Well, it's definitely true that the US administration is perfectly willing to carry out a genocide. They've been backing Israel unconditionally for much longer than the past couple of months. And Israel has been a state with a genocidal project for much longer than the past couple of months. The difference is that right now there's no excuse to not be able to see it. It's being live streamed in extreme amounts. The escalation is to extreme conditions. What happened this morning is absolutely horrific. What happened and what the US media definitely will not be reporting on is that actually the Israeli occupation forces suffered a defeat in another neighborhood of Gaza City called Zaytun, and they were forced to withdraw. And instead of just withdrawing, they took out their frustration by shooting on people who had been waiting since the night before for aid. This is a section of Gaza that has been surviving on animal feed. And the first time a flour truck would enter into the region and give people some relief from living on not human grade edible food. They've been surviving on animal feed and barely enough of that as it is. They opened fire on these people who are seeking aid. They used tanks to run over people. They shot at people's upper bodies. And then Israeli spokespeople said that this was actually, the deaths were caused by a stampede. It's blatant lies. There's Israeli sources as well who have confirmed that this was a direct assault on the people who were seeking aid. This is supposedly a humanitarian corridor where this was happening. It's just blatantly obvious that there is a desire for extermination on the behalf of the Israeli occupation. They also took a number of people to an undisclosed area. They've been doing this repeatedly over the past couple months, where they kidnap large groups of Palestinians and detain them and torture them in other places and don't release what they're doing. So that again happened. It's really, really horrific. And people are now there is no excuse for anyone to be able to deny the genocidal nature of the Israeli project. And if you think about it, the entire Israeli society is conditioned for this. People are forced to do or highly pressured. It's very extreme if you don't do it because you'll go to jail. People are forced to serve in the Israeli occupation forces when they're teenagers. They're brainwashed constantly with their own political leaders calling for the mass extermination of Palestinian people, comparing them to animals. This didn't just start happening since October 7th. This has been the status quo since before. But now it's visible to everyone. And I think a major reason why it's visible to everyone is actually the mass mobilizations. It would be a lot different if people weren't constantly putting pressure on the US government, putting pressure on the media, making it so that people cannot ignore the reality and that the US and their Zionist partners cannot control the narrative. That has played a major element in how Biden and and the Israelis are assessing the correlation of forces and trying to move forward. It's horrific what is happening, absolutely horrific. But Biden is very fully aware that he cannot continue to give a blank check to the Israelis to execute genocide without suffering consequences at home. There's been now we're coming near on his re-election campaign, and massive numbers of people, unprecedented numbers of people have voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries. Besides that, neither him nor anyone else who is pro-genocide is able to have a moment's peace. They're constantly being followed, tagged. All their events are being disrupted. Mass mobilizations are reaching a level that we have not seen before in history for the Palestinian cause. And we're actually coming up on a global day of action that is shaping up to be one of the most significant yet. Many countries across the world are participating. Cuba just announced that it's putting out a call for national mobilizations. Over 50 countries in the United States, 50 cities, in the United States are going to be participating. So I think it's important to show that while the U.S. government is acting with military might, it is acting with unconditional support to Israel, despite some of the kind of discourse maneuvers it wants to make. The mass mobilizations are significant, are having an impact, and they are being seen and witnessed by people on the ground in Gaza and in Palestine. And it's very important that we keep them up and that we keep putting on the pressure and make it so that it is extremely untenable for these politicians to continue their policy of extermination against the Palestinian people without consequence.
No, I think it's an extraordinarily important point. And about an hour ago, President Gustavo Petro of Colombia announced that they're suspending arms sales. And if you know anything about that, the security relationship between Colombia and Israel is very significant. So that in and of itself is significant. Well, you already sort of spoke to it, Layan, I think in terms of what we are seeing in terms of the growth of mass movements and protest. And I mean, it really does feel like in some ways, you know, that's a key part of this story is I think that despite this huge amount of mass killing, 30,000 people, really more than that, obviously, when we include those who are continue to be trapped under the rubble, well over 70,000 people have been injured, many of them really maimed in ways that will change their lives forever. Obviously, the psychological trauma of every single person, that's in any way, shape, or form adjacent to this. But I say all that to say that despite all of that, it feels that they have been unable to actually crush the resilience of the people of Gaza and Palestine in general and the will to resist. And it feels that in and of itself is one of the factors that's inspiring people to keep going, because it is, I think for most of us outside of it, almost borderline miraculous to see that despite all of this, there's still so much resilience. The videos you see coming out of Gaza, the kids protesting for food, all these different things that, it's terrible to see, but it really does say something. And it feels like that's a big catalyst for this. And also maybe the biggest Achilles heel for the strategy of the U.S. and others, because I think they were hoping that there would be more sort of grinding down of Palestinians, but people continue to stand upright.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, they keep on making the same mistake over and over in history. You'd think that they might learn by now that you can't colonize a people and then expect them to just take it. In fact, the Palestinian struggle is one that is full of principle. It is full of dignity, and this is something that you can't break in the human spirit by just terror and by trying to make the world forget about it. In fact, Israel has not managed to achieve its military goals. They are trying now to force a military victory through what they're calling negotiations, which again are being done under conditions of starvation, under conditions of genocide. You cannot negotiate when one of the partners is being held with a knife to the throat. And I think I'm losing the connection. Am I still there?
We got you.
Okay, great. And a big part of this battle has consistently been the battle for public opinion and the battle for the control over the narrative. And we've seen how much money the Zionist institutions have put and thrown into making sure that the pro-Israel narrative is dominant, especially in the US and Europe. The mass mobilization and the mass movement for Palestine across the world has destroyed this front of the struggle. I mean, they have totally destroyed the control over the narrative at this point. It really have put Israel on the defensive in an extreme. And now the question is whether or not they are going to be able to find excuses for what they're doing. And they're trying to find excuses. You saw that with the massacre this morning. They said, well, no, actually it wasn't us. It was a stampede. But they are cracking at the seams. Lloyd Austin today said he admitted to 25,000 deaths of women and children in Palestine, and the Pentagon quickly tried to correct that statement. They said, we can't confirm any of the casualties that have been reported by the Gaza Health Ministry. Well, too bad, because the entire world is confirming it for you. I mean, the movement now has become the source of information and the source of confirmation for what is actually happening, and has been witnessing the resilience of the Palestinian people that is not new, that has been resisting since 75 years, also under conditions of genocide. And what's different now is that the entire world is cognizant to it, is recognizing it, and is very inspired by the strength of the Palestinian people, who have managed to maintain and managed to not close the question of the colonization of the Palestinian lands for over 75 years in the face of the greatest military mights in the world. So it's really, really impressive, very inspiring, and especially inspiring to those people who across the world are facing also conditions of oppression, different conditions of oppression, but conditions the same that are also characterized by U.S. imperialism, and that puts them right up in a battle against U.S. imperialist interests. So it's really a turning point, I think, for the world in its struggle against U.S. imperialism and for what the future of humanity is going to look like. A lot of things have been called into question, and a lot more people are alert to the role that U.S. imperialism plays in the everyday lives of people that we can relate to. And it's been incredible to see the level of humanity that people are feeling for those who are resisting and fighting back in Palestine every single day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Layan, as always, we really appreciate you being willing to take some time out of your very busy day. Layan Fuleihan, the Education Director of the People's Forum, thank you so much for your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
My goodness, I just, I don't know. Every day, I'm just like, how much longer? It's shocking. The level of like celebrated depravity by the Israelis is even more shocking. Live streamed. It's just a live stream genocide. Like, I don't know what to say anymore, Eugene. I've just run out of things to say. At this point, if you don't stand against genocide, like there's no moving you anymore. There's no argument to be made. You either are pro-genocide or you're not. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Well, we want to turn our attention here now to another long-running conflict, and that is in Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which just several days ago passed the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of that conflict. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Brian Becker, who's the host of the Socialist program, which you, of course, can watch here on Breakthrough News, 7 o'clock Wednesday. That's Eastern time, 7 o'clock every single week on video. And they also have a couple great podcasts you can check out every single week as well. Brian, thanks so much for being back with us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you here to discuss what has to be one of the most manipulated issues, at least in the U.S. and European media, and that's Ukraine. We're 2 years in. I mean, maybe I'm just whistling in the wind here, but I mean, it seems that we're in sort of a bizarre situation where I can't possibly see how Ukraine can win. They seem to have almost already lost, but nonetheless, there's still this big discussion being driven by the U.S. and the U.S. administration in Europe to double down, to provide more money and more weapons. Where do we stand 2 years in?
Well, interestingly, just a few hours ago, the head of state of Russia, Vladimir Putin, spoke to the Russian people, to the Russian nation, in a annual televised address. It's kind of their State of the Union address. And he took up the issue of Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, suggesting, as he did in the last few days, that NATO countries should be ready to send troops to Ukraine to rescue the failing war effort that the Ukrainian armed forces have been waging for the last 2 years, with death and destruction on both sides, numbering in the hundreds of thousands in terms of the casualties, dead and wounded. So Macron is like, no, let's send NATO troops to fight in Ukraine. So Putin addressed this, Rania and Eugene. He addressed it just a few hours ago, and he said, we are telling them, including the president of France and the NATO countries, that we have nuclear weapons, and these weapons reach targets in your country. If you decide to do as others in history have done, and he's obviously referring to both Hitler and Napoleon, which is to bring military forces towards Russian territory. And let's remember that Russia now considers the Donbass, the eastern areas of Ukraine, or formerly part of Ukraine, and the southern part of Ukraine called Crimea, to now be officially part of Russia. So Putin is saying to them, if you go forward with this madness, you have the responsibility to tell your people that we have nuclear weapons and we will, as we have in the past, defend Russia with all of our might. So Putin is raising the stakes. This is a big raising of the stakes by the Russian government. He said, you must understand, meaning a message to Macron and, of course, to Biden and Blinken and Sullivan, the ones who really drove this war. You must remember that the existence of civilization is now at threat, is now at risk, now at risk of being destroyed. This is in the last few hours. Here you have the U.S. government fighting a proxy war against the Palestinian people, because that's what the Gaza genocide is. You know, Israel couldn't go on one more day if Biden put his foot down. It's a proxy war. The U.S. wants Israel to destroy Hamas and win the battle, win the war in Gaza, and they want to do the same thing in Ukraine. So they're using other people to fight American imperialism's war. And on both fronts, they're not going to succeed. They're not going to succeed in Ukraine because Russia is a strong country. It has 5,000 or 6,000 operational nuclear weapons. And they're not going to succeed against the Palestinian people, who have no army, no air force, and no navy, but who have this spirit of resistance, as Layan, your earlier guest, talked about, a spirit of resistance that will not be extinguished. And here we are, you know, let's just think Korean War, Vietnam War, Afghanistan War, Iraq War, Libya War, Syria War. I mean, war after war after war. The U.S. is not winning these wars, but it's constantly waging these wars and letting the rest of the world know that they're ready to do anything. They started in 1945, dropping nuclear bombs on civilian cities in Japan, proving to the world that they have a weapon that no one else possessed. And unlike the rest of the world, they were willing to kill hundreds of thousands of civilians in an instant. So all of this manifests military power to show we're the boss. And I think on all fronts, the only thing that they're succeeding at is creating oceans of human misery, but not tactical or strategic, and certainly not military success.
You know, Brian, I do wonder, does it matter who becomes president, whether this war continues or ends, or this Cold War, should I say, continues or ends? So like even putting Ukraine aside, because there's a lot of conversation and all we can do is speculate, but like, you know, there's this from one end on the Trump side of things, there's people who will argue that Trump's going to end the war in Ukraine because actually they oppose that war, which I don't think is actually true, but I'd love to hear your take on that. And then there's another way of looking at this, since you brought up Gaza, or the argument I hear is that, oh, but Trump would be so much worse on Gaza. And all I can think is, well, what's worse than genocide? So I'm just curious if you could address those issues, because that's the conversation I keep seeing on the internet.
Well, at least what I'm getting from your question, I'm not suggesting it's a loaded question, but what I'm getting,
I mean, not at all, Brian. I don't know why anybody would think that.
I'm getting from your question that you think those things are BS, very bad sociology. And I would agree with that, because Trump won't end the war in Ukraine unless America is completely defeated. Let's not forget, Trump did that which Obama refused to do in terms of escalation on Ukraine. Trump sent the Javelin missiles to Ukraine, and Obama, before he left office, said, don't send Javelin missiles to Ukraine. That will escalate the struggle. That will create the contradiction such that an out-and-out military conflict might happen. So Trump went far beyond Obama. So this idea from the Republican right wing that they're anti-war, and some idiots on the left who somehow sort of reflect this as if there's some hope within the mega world that there's going to be a less militarized imperialist foreign policy, that's nonsense. And Trump, when it comes to Gaza, when it comes to the Palestinians, one of his first acts was to declare that Jerusalem, in violation of international law, would become the capital of Israel. That's a violation of international law. I mean, that is a clear sort of gift to Netanyahu. Netanyahu was his poodle all that time. But is there anything worse than what Joe Biden is doing? The answer to that, too, is no. because as you're suggesting, Rania, there is nothing more heinous than genocide. It's the ultimate war crime, the ultimate criminal act, the extinguishing of a people in whole or in part. Those 12,500 Palestinian kids, or as I think one of you mentioned, almost 25. Oh, you quoted Rania, Lloyd Austin saying at first that 25,000 women and children have been killed in your last segment, and then they tried to walk it back. Those kids and their moms who were killed, they weren't killed because they did something to Israel. They were killed because they're Palestinians. So the definition of genocide, the destruction of a people in whole or in part, is manifestly obvious by the U.S. conduct and the U.S.-Israeli conduct in Gaza. They're killing children and their mothers because of who they are, because they are Palestinians living in Gaza. So you can't be worse than Joe Biden, but Trump will be equally bad. Like, there is no hope within the two capitalist parties. There is no hope. I mean, there's actually no hope within the U.S. electoral system because it's rigged so that really progressive candidates like Claudia de la Cruz, there are others who are running, Jill Stein, Cornel West, they are going to run important campaigns, but they're excluded from the debates. They can't get on TV. We're running as a protest, as a demonstration in the electoral arena against the system that's so, sort of addicted to militarism and war. But this system in the electoral system is rigged so only those two ruling class parties get to win. So if you think like maybe this ruling class party will help me or this ruling class party will help me, then you're not understanding the problem. The problem isn't this politician or that politician. I thought that when I was 15 and protesting against the war in Vietnam, I thought, oh, if only we could have another president, this war would end, this genocide against Vietnam would end. It's not the politicians, it's the system, and the politicians are simply the operators of the system. They're there, they should be condemned, but they're not going to change anything. We need, in fact, a new system. But how do you get to a new system? It doesn't come all at once. You can't snap your fingers. This is a process of revolutionary and radicalization of a population through mass movements, through mobilizations, through teach-ins, through breakthrough news, through all kinds of platforms that are, bring enlightenment to the people about what the nature of this system is. This system is addicted to war because one, war is good business for the capitalists, and two, war is the method by which U.S. imperialism, the corporate Wall Street elite, maintain their domination over the rest of the world. It's a rich man's war. We pay for it, but it's their war. And we have to bring consciousness about why, in fact, we need a new system.
No, I think those are important points. Glad you brought up the issue of Donald Trump, who in the recent New York Times article about the CIA's role in the war in Ukraine said that when he became president, only strengthened collaboration between the CIA and Ukrainian intelligence. But, it leads to my other point, which I think is picking up what you were saying there in the end. I mean, it seems like, Brian, so much of what is out there, the mainstream media, the politicians, is also trying to hide the true nature of the war. I mean, you have so much in the Macron piece that you referenced at the very beginning. Oh, there's no boots on the ground. Oh, we're not involved. But then every time you turn around, it's like the CIA is running the whole thing and they have a string of bases that are over there. You have these mercenaries that are there. There are special forces that, it's unclear exactly what they're doing, but seem to be moving in and out of Ukraine, helping various different aspects of this, but that they are desperately afraid that people will actually get a sense of how deep the involvement is of these U.S. military, European militaries, because if people feel, hey, we might be getting embroiled in another potential nuclear war with boots on the ground where our friends, neighbors, and loved ones may die, that then the support for the war may wane. So I wonder what you think about that, especially, building off that New York Times expose of the CIA basically controlling the whole issue.
Yeah, it's a U.S. war. I mean, Ukraine is now a colony. It's essentially a colony. You might call it an independent sovereign country. It's not. It's been colonized by the United States. It was formerly a part of the Soviet Union. I mean, Kiev was formerly the capital of Russia for 300 years. They've taken over all of the former parts of the Soviet Union, not all of them, but many parts of them in the former socialist government allies of Russia in the Eastern and Central Europe. They said, we're gonna fight against communism because we're gonna have freedom. No, it's not freedom. It's colonization under another name. bringing countries in Eastern and Central Europe into NATO is colonization. And the U.S. government is not only taken over their intelligence services through the CIA, which we now know, Eugene, based on this reporting. It's also the economy is being taken over by U.S. Wall Street banks and hedge funds and equity firms. All of Ukraine, including the public property, which was socialist property from 1922 until 1991, socialist property for the benefit of the people, that's all being ripped away from their country and taken over by Wall Street. And finally, if the U.S. government, the real reason Biden isn't sending troops to Ukraine isn't really that much about Russia, even though that's a factor, because Russia now is making it clear it won't tolerate it. The American people would not tolerate it. Both of you know, I think, and I certainly feel it, that if Biden said this war in Ukraine is so urgent, we must fight for the honor, the dignity, the self-determination, the sovereignty of countries, not just in Ukraine, but all over Europe. And so we're going to send American young men and women to fight against the Russians in Ukraine. There would be millions of people. Some of them vote Democrat, some of them vote Republican, a lot of them vote independent, a lot of them don't vote at all. They would be in the streets in the United States because there is actually no tolerance by the American people for another war like this. They would rebel against it. So they're using colonized countries like Ukraine as complete proxies. I feel so terrible for the Ukrainian people. Their children are becoming ground up in this war. And the main complaint of the Pentagon officials, when you read between the lines, is that Ukrainians are becoming, quote, casualty averse, meaning they don't want their kids to keep dying in this endless war. But people all over the world are casualty averse. They don't want war. And that goes for the American people, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is, a very good summary of where we are 2 years in, and more in front of us, and of course, warmongering, but we will continue to cover it, as will the Socialist Program. And Brian Becker, you are the host of the Socialist Program, whose video version you can see here on Breakthrough News, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Wednesday. Thanks so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, that was a great show, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent topics, important topics, great guests. I feel like it's a dark moment, but we always have to stay optimistic. I try. I'm sorry. Today's one of those days where I'm
wow,
just,
that did not sound very optimistic, but
yeah, I just feel, I
guess you are trying. That's what you said you were doing.
I feel very beaten down. I got to recharge a little bit so I can come back strong and actually exude some optimism.
Yes.
That said, I actually do have something nice to say.
Okay.
I usually have to yell at our viewers to please like the show as they're watching. And sometimes I, finger wag. But I want to say thank you to our viewers this time, because as many as we're watching, actually more than we're watching, have liked, or more than have watched consecutively, have liked the show. So what that has taught me is that yelling works.
Okay, that's one way to look at it. I'll be waiting for your new child rearing book
Bullying
explaining
works,
all of that.
Guys.
Well, I think that will bring us to the end of our show here today. I think one other thing that might make Rania happy is if you went to patreon.com/breakthrough news and became a patron. Your very generous support is what keeps pushing us forward. And, you can do a good deed for both Breakthrough News and Rania Khalek. Patreon.com/breakthrough news. We really, really could use your help, and we really, really appreciate everything. We know it's a sacrifice. It's tough to make it out here. But we thank everyone who's making that sacrifice on a monthly basis to help us out. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. Just right under your screen there on YouTube, hit the bell so that you can get alerts about the things that you have subscribed to, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. And, continue to watch, continue to patronize us. We really appreciate everybody who is here. Thanks to all our guests as well. So for myself, for Rania Khalek, for our Breakthrough News team, we'll see you next time.